Hello, everyone. Good morning, good evening from wherever you are in the world. Thank you for joining us today for this GMAT Club webinar on how to crack the Kellogg interview. We're going to take just a moment maybe while folks are still joining before we begin. So as we get started, we'd love to hear from you. Could you post in the chat box, where you're from, where you're at in your MBA application process, maybe even throw in why you're so excited about Kellogg, because you've got myself, Talan, and Matt on the line, both Kellogg alums. So we're very passionate about Kellogg as a choice for your MBA. So we'll take just a moment here while you guys kind of type in the chat box, and then we will start by introducing ourselves in a moment. All right. Well, I do see that it is 2 minutes past the time. So I don't know if now is a good time to start introducing ourselves, perhaps, Matt. When you're ready, you can go ahead and start.
Sure. My name is Matt Strickler. I'm a senior consultant with the MBA Exchange. I've been with the MBA Exchange for more than a decade now. More importantly, from this conversation, I'm a JD MBA graduate of Kellogg and Northwestern Law. I spent 3 years on the Kellogg admissions committee, and also was a alumni interviewer for Kellogg. Professionally, I spent most of my time in management consulting and tech. And prior to business school, I used to jump out of airplanes and blow things up for the U.S. Army. Talan.
All right. Well, hello, everyone, again. My name is Talan Rindels, and I am a senior admissions consultant at the MBA Exchange, similar to Matt. I also serve a bit on our management team as an onboarder as well. By trade, CPG and retail is really my area of expertise. I've worked for companies that you may know, like General Mills, as well as Target Corporation, which is a big retailer here in the U.S. where I am based. I am a proud Kellogg alum. I concentrated my studies at Kellogg in marketing. And then also, while I was at Kellogg, I was involved in a number of different, groups, one of which was the Kellogg Run Bike Swim Club, so the triathlon club that I helped to create alongside a couple of my peers. Running and, living a very, a life full of wellness is really important to me. And that was why, I went ahead and created that organization to invite other people to do the same. Like Matt, I'm also a former admissions interviewer for Kellogg, so really had that direct connectivity with Kellogg AdComs and heard directly from them, what they're looking for to really build out the classes that, a well-rounded class at Kellogg. And then, as I mentioned, CPG and retail is really my area of expertise. So one way that I've continued to stay involved and connected with Kellogg as an alum is that I serve as an industry advisor for folks who want to get into CPG and retail, who may have a lot of questions about how to make that switch or how to best position themselves in the recruiting process. And so it's really nice to have that connectivity with current students and understand what the lay of the land really is like today, because it has changed since a little bit less than a decade, so a little bit less than Matt for me, since I graduated from Kellogg. Another fun fact is that I'm also a first-generation undergrad. And the reason why I think that that's important here is because really that's paramount in what's driving me to be here today. So I didn't grow up in a family that, business was a common thing, right? I mean, I grew up in a very blue-collar family. And so when I decided that I wanted to go to business school, it wasn't innate in who I was to know, how to go about that process. And so I had some key mentors and coaches who invested in me and helped to provide me with the tools and resources to really position myself for candidacy at schools like Kellogg. And that's also with a 690 GMAT. So definitely a below average GMAT as well. So I had some things to overcome. And so, being here today and being involved with the MBA Exchange is really my opportunity to give back to those people who had invested in me by, investing in the next generation of talent like yourself. I'm also super passionate about diversity and inclusion in the workplace. Whether that be gender identity, whether that be sexual orientation, race, anything, I really believe that everybody's voice deserves to be heard. And so one of the things that I do to drive that inclusion is I serve as an ambassador for the Network of Executive Women as well, which is a big player in the CPG and retail space. So let's see, I'm taking a look at the chat box here and trying to understand where many of our audience members are from. So I'm seeing India, Malaysia, preparing for the GMAT. Okay, so we got someone who's a little bit more of an eager beaver on here and already thinking about the interview process while preparing for the GMAT. That is wonderful to hear, Tan. Let's see. College selection process. Great. Well, hopefully you'll get something out of this today as well by learning a little bit more about what Kellogg is about through our conversation around the interviewing process. And we've got some folks who it's morning as well here in the US. Well, thank you guys all for participating in the chat. Throughout the conversation today, we'd love to make this as interactive as possible. So I invite you to continue to use the chat box to raise questions, comment if something is really jiving for you. Anything and everything is on the table. And then also at the end of the presentation and the content that we prepared today, we'll also pause and take some time for an actual Q&A session as well to address any lingering questions at the end as well. All right, so with that, let's flip to the next slide. I will tell you just a little bit about who we are at the MBA Exchange, and then we will dive into that rich content that you guys are all looking for. So who or what is the MBA Exchange? We are a full-service admissions consulting company that has been around for a long time, almost 3 decades, probably the longest of virtually any admissions company out there. And because of that tenure, we have helped thousands and thousands of talented individuals like yourself really become their best, unpack their stories in a way that will resonate with AdCom. Through this, we have 60 former admissions officers and MBA grads from top schools within the world, like Harvard, Stanford, Kellogg, of course, Wharton, INSEAD, London Business School. So we aren't just talking US business schools, definitely international schools as well. We're based all over the world. And so that really allows us to be really effective and quick in working with folks from anywhere in the world. Sometimes we use, that time zone difference to our advantage as well. Receiving things, you can be working on things while we're sleeping, and then we're working on things while you're sleeping. So it can really bode for a very, engaging interaction with us, given our geographic diversity here. We're also, you can also find more about us, through different publications that we've been recognized in, things like Business Week and CNN and New York Times. So if you're interested in learning more about us, definitely just, type us in Google and you can learn a whole lot more. Otherwise, I also invite you to take a look at our website at www.mbaexchange.com. We'll share that again at the end. And, if Abhijat could actually write that in the chat box too, then it'll be there for you. Oh, and I see he did. Wonderful. Thank you. All right. Well, with that, let's dive into the content that you guys are all here for today.
Great.
Take it away, Matt.
Thanks. So today, I think the place to start is, really focus on Kellogg and what's specific to the Kellogg interview. So that's where we're going to start. There's some general guidance on, interviews and video interviews. We'll make sure we cover those. We're going to highlight some of the most common question, those core questions that you need to be able to address. Talk about behavioral interviews and lightly touch on, what are some of the challenging questions that we've seen. And I think importantly, we'll come back to, hey, at the end of the interview, you're going to need to be prepared to ask your own questions. So why is that important, and what does that mean? But let's start off with the basics for the Kellogg interview. Unlike most schools, Kellogg tries to interview everyone, right? Generally before you apply, right? So it really distinguishes itself from other schools in this regard. Now, they do grant exceptions if people aren't able to be interviewed because of logistical or administration considerations, but nearly everyone gets interviewed. So this is a great opportunity. And one, if you're thinking of applying to Kellogg, you need to be prepared for. Okay, so who interviews, right? So it could be, any one of, full-time admission staff, sort of the student admissions, interviewers, and alumni. Now, the reality is the last 2 years, and in general, most interviews are conducted by alumni. Now, you know, Talon and I are both, former alumni, interviewers, right? And so our experience, there's annual training. I remember getting, back in the day, a booklet with, here's Kellogg, here's what we're looking for, here's example questions, right? So there is a broad scheme to try and make the interviews as consistent as possible across the alumni interview. But every alumni is, different, right? Different experiences, different backgrounds, and so there is obviously still some variability in the questions, right? So the format, right? Kellogg will say, hey, it's only virtual at this time. I have seen some interview reports that have mentioned being in person, but virtual still seems to be the norm. Ordinarily, you could do it, in person, either on campus or off campus with an alumni, but it's definitely virtual at this time. But be sure to check, particularly for those applying in the fall for round one, if there are any changes. Now, how long this should last, right? I think this is probably one of the most variable. My experience with full-time admission staff and even students who are interviewing is it's generally 30 minutes. Could extend to 40 minutes, but they often do back-to-back interviews and keep it very short. With alumni interviewers, I'd say, the average is probably closer to 40, 45 minutes. I had a recent, candidate, just a couple months ago, his interview lasted almost an hour and a half, right? That's certainly the exception rather than the norm. But if you're interviewing with somebody from the admission staff and it goes 30 minutes, perfectly normal, right? They've got a tight schedule to keep. They could be somewhat, stoic and curt. It doesn't mean the interview is going badly at all. It tends to be more conversational. The alumni interviewers tend to tell you a little bit more about their background and their experiences at Kellogg. So those can go a little bit longer as well. Now, I know everyone is worried about, okay, what do I wear to an interview, right? And Kellogg is one of those schools that explicitly calls out that the business casual attire is entirely appropriate, right? And so, feel free to be comfortable, wear business casual attire. I'm a little bit old school. I like throwing on the jacket. I hated wearing a tie, so anytime I don't have to wear a tie, I take it. But it's never wrong to be a little bit overdressed. But I think the most important thing is be comfortable in the interview. You'll likely do better as well, right? I think that the last thing is, okay, so what are interviewers looking for? Well, so you're going to get graded on a set of attributes. They'll give you a numeric score, and then they'll provide some commentary to the admissions staff. Now, they haven't seen your application. Even the admissions officers that are interviewing you, they haven't seen your applications. Everything is blind. So all they have is your interview heading into this, right? So they're not trying to trick you. They're not trying to intimidate you. They're really trying to learn as much as they can about you. Now, having said that, interviewers are grading you on a certain set of attributes, I'm sure one of the logical questions is, okay, so what are they grading me on? Well, Kellogg is one of the few schools that's pretty explicit in what they're looking for, right? This isn't some, secret insider knowledge that Talon and I pulled together, right? This is right from the Kellogg website, right? So if we look at, they value individuals who can motivate a team, aren't afraid to challenge the status quo, right? Bring energy, creativity, intellect, seek diversity and who they interact with, and are collaborative, right? And so when they boil it down to their explicit criteria, right? Like, I would like circle this, underline this, remember this, right? They put it out there. Again, it's not some secret insider knowledge. They're looking for really smart people, right? That have demonstrated the intellectual ability to both succeed and excel at Kellogg. They're looking for people with strong work experience, right? Demonstrated, career progression that have had an impact in the companies that they're working for, right? They're looking for people that have their professional goals, both short term, post MBA, and long term, and know how an MBA and an MBA at Kellogg fit into their short term and long term goals. They're looking for people either with leadership experience, but more importantly, leadership potential, because they know not everyone gets an opportunity to be in a leadership role prior to Kellogg, right? They're looking for people that have impact, right? That's impact professionally. That's impact, in outside activities that they're involved with. That's impact in their own personal lives, right? They're looking for people that make a difference, right? And they're looking for people that are team players with strong interpersonal skills, right? So there should be no doubt, right, how Kellogg is going to evaluate, your candidacy, and no doubt how the interviewer is going to evaluate, your performance, right? The criteria are right on this page. Okay, so now let's turn it over to one of the admissions associate directors and talk about, okay, so how important is the interview, right? It's not one of these cases where I've done the application and I'm one of the people that have been invited to interview, right? So there's a 50-50 chance or whatever the chance is. Everyone gets an equal opportunity, right? And so, if you listen, and this message has been consistent for years now, right? It's just one component. It's important, but it's just one part, right? Everybody talks about, holistic, right? This generally doesn't make or break your application. Although having said that, I would say, Kellogg is looking for people that they consider a fit for their program, right? And so if if you don't meet those criteria, right, and it certainly comes across, you've got bad interpersonal skills, you're not a team player, right? This could certainly, hurt your chances. So you want to make sure that you're prepared and able to cover, each of those different points that they're looking for. Okay, so finally, how to prepare, right? I'm going to spend a bunch more time, covering this in detail. But let's hear what Christy Heaton has to say about this. Okay, so what's the interview like? How should I prepare? No surprise, like most MBA interviews, they're primarily behavioral based, right? So you need to be familiar. And if you're not familiar with that, it's, tell me about a time that, right? And we'll cover behavioral based interviews in more details. Now, her advice is, hey, practice good methods to answer behavioral questions, right? So she mentions the STAR method, right? Which hopefully many of you are, familiar with. But if you're not, right, basically it's situation, task, action, and result. The context of the situation you were in, what you were asked to accomplish, the actions that you took, and the results of those actions. Now, it's not the only potential method, right? There's a situation, complication, resolution. There's, situation or context, action, result. The important part is, not exactly which method you use, but there are some tried and true methods where you provide some context, right? And talk about, what needed to be done. You talk about the actions, the results, and even the learnings, right? So, okay, make sure that behavioral based, you know how to address those types of questions, and no surprise, right? Practice makes perfect, right? And you want to make sure you have a range of stories, and this is a point that we'll come back to again, right? You won't be able to answer every potential question that an interviewer could throw your way, right? Exactly. You won't be able to prepare for every single type of question, but you can prepare for them by having a bank of stories, right, across your professional, personal, extracurricular lives that touch on those dimensions that are most important to Kellogg. And this last point that she calls out, right, and it's the Kellogg, emphasis on be your authentic self, right? It's not my emphasis, right? There's a difference between being prepared with lots of examples and stories that you share that are tailored to the particular question that you're being asked, and being scripted and repeating something that you've memorized. Very easy to tell in an interview. Okay, so we've come to the conclusion of what to expect and what Kellogg is looking for. Now let's take a couple minutes and talk about prepping for interviews, some quick interview tips and some virtual interview tips before we dive into some of the most common questions that you need to be prepared to answer. Okay, so this is a framework that we pulled together just to highlight all the different pieces that that we recommend in preparing for an interview at Kellogg or any school, right? So first, there's understanding the school. In this particular case, you want to do your research. You want to be sure that you go deep, and this is more than just news articles, blogs. If you can, you really want to be able to talk to a current or recent grad and be able to answer, be able to ask them questions about, the program, their experience, what they like, what they don't like, and hopefully find someone with, similar interests and backgrounds to be able to talk, specifics that you just won't be able to find at the same level of detail in online material, right? And then you also know you're doing research in order to help answer questions that are going to come up, right? 99% of people get asked, well, why Kellogg for your MBA? Or, where will you contribute at Kellogg? So I want to emphasize that particularly for a school like Kellogg, you want to make sure you've done as much research as you possibly can, given your logistical constraints, to understand Kellogg, the programs, the people, the direction, the dean's priorities, the values, the extracurricular activities that you can be involved with, so that you can weave that into the conversation when you have your interview. We can always tell when somebody is well prepared for a Kellogg interview. Okay, then there's preparing for the interview questions that you can expect to get, right? So here, emphasize again, right? You're not preparing for every potential question that you could get. You want to make sure that you have your bank of stories that you're able to leverage for what Kellogg cares about. Being able to talk about leadership, teamwork, interpersonal skills, etc. So we've grouped them into sort of the common 4 questions that you absolutely should expect to see in an interview and get asked in 90+%. All of them get asked in 90+%. We'll talk a little bit more about behavioral questions, and then touch lightly on those challenging questions, right? There's some questions that are tough for just about everybody. But I think it's also equally important. You have the stories, you understand sort of the basic questions that you're going to be asked. You should, practice the STAR format, or, whatever particular format that works for you, to really make sure to emphasize.
Hey, Matt,
Yeah.
one question that we often get is how far back in my life can I go with my stories? Does it have to be from my career and my work experience? Or could I draw from things that happen, in university or in the community? So could you touch on that for a moment?
Yeah, I think that there's certainly, recency is better, right? We're most interested in those experiences that have happened most recently. So that's generally a combination of, professional and, what you're doing, outside of work. That's more recent. Now, having said that, there are certainly cases where you've done something, exceptional in college that could be worth mentioning, or something you've done in college or even before that helps cover a story arc, right? If you're talking about leadership, right? Maybe you don't have a great example at work because you're not in a leadership role, but you've got something outside of work. You had some great leadership in college. That could be completely relevant as well. But yes, it doesn't have to be just professional. It doesn't have to be recent, but the I would say that the focus should be, recent is better than not.
Thank you.
All right, great. Okay, so you've got an understanding of Kellogg, right? You know the questions that are likely to be asked, right? And here, right, you can go to interview debriefs, and GMAT Club, has a number of interview debriefs, right? If you Google GMAT Club interview debrief, and look up Kellogg, you'll get a range of interview debriefs. I was looking at some of those just this morning on questions that were asked, right? And there were people from all over the world that had done these recently, and I think you'll find a lot of the questions very similar to the ones that we're gonna talk about. But also you'll see that there's quite a wide variability in particularly the behavioral questions, right? But certainly leverage that as a resource to see the common kinds of questions, sort of beyond the ones that we'll highlight today. Okay. So, next point is be ready for the interview, right? There's some logistics on, any interview, particularly the Kellogg interview. We've covered that already and what to expect in the Kellogg interview. And I'll quickly touch on some uh, interview best practices and the virtual format next. Now, I think finally, right, and this is something that people often overlook, is you want to make sure you have questions at the end, right? I mean, this is a great opportunity to learn more. If you haven't been able to talk to somebody and see whether Kellogg's a great fit, it's a great opportunity to show that you've done your homework and your research and are excited about the school. So you definitely want to make sure you have, we recommend 3 questions, even if you only get to ask one. Often with alumni interviewers, they got a little bit more flexibility in their time. And if you ask a good question, they'll be like, what else? And the conversation can just flow from there, right? So if we think about what we're going to cover today and what we're not going to cover, right? These areas I've highlighted in gray, that's what we're going to focus on today, right? And the time that we have, we couldn't possibly focus on everything, and I'm sure it's going to feel like we've gone through some of this too quickly to begin with, as well. But these are the things that we're gonna touch on. And first up, right, I'm actually going to cover some of our thoughts on interview best practices, right? So we've said that this the interview will be conversational, it'll be friendly, they're going to be trying to find out more about you, right? And that doesn't mean that you shouldn't expect follow-up questions, right? It's quite common that someone will look at your resume and there'll be something that resonates that they want to understand more, that's separate from anything that we're going to be talking about. So they could ask follow-up questions, or they'll walk me through your resume or leadership question that you could ask. There could be follow-up questions to probe a little bit more deeply, if they find your answer doesn't fully cover everything that they were expecting. And quite honestly, every once in a while you get somebody, whether it's at Kellogg or other business schools, that just woke up on the wrong side of bed, right? And the interview is going to be a little bit more challenging and less friendly than possible. So certainly not the norm, but should always be prepared if that happens, right? Now, I think one of the important things is, right, you should have an idea, like, what are the key things that you want to communicate as well, to ensure that you're getting across your full story, right? And if you don't get a chance to talk about those in the questions that you're asked, right, you want to make sure you get an opportunity to talk about it at the end. Often one of the questions is, well, what else haven't I asked you that I should understand? That's a great opportunity if they haven't covered like your biggest accomplishment or something that you're particularly proud of or some story that highlights why you're a great fit for Kellogg. So going in with, hey, there's actually a couple things that I want to communicate about myself, and if they don't come up, I want to be proactive in trying to cover that. Now, particularly for the question on, walk me through your resume or tell me about your story, right? I've got your resume right in front of me. Please don't read your resume, back to me, right? You want to compliment, what you're saying. So what does that mean? That means, and actually we'll cover it a little bit more in a second, right? But it's being able to cover highlights, talk about key accomplishments, talk about the why, not just say, okay, I did this, then I moved to this. You want to think thoughtfully about, how to do this. Okay. And then the big thing that I've already sort of previewed is you want to have that bank of stories, right, that allows you to prepare for any of the behavioral questions rather than trying to, answer specifically the laundry list of hundreds of potential behavioral questions that you could come up with. Now, one of the things that's a personal pet peeve is people that spend too much time on the context, right, or the situation, right? I say, okay, tell me about a leadership situation, right? And 2.5 minutes later, you're still telling me about the situation, right? You haven't gotten to what you did, the results, what you've learned, and that's what I really care about, right? So you want to keep the context of the situation at the bare minimum, right? And anytime you're going beyond 2.5 or 3 minutes to answer any question, right, you should think, okay, am I doing it as efficiently as possible, right? Now, for all of the prep that you do, right, there could be that question that you completely don't expect, right? Perfectly okay to say, hey, can I take a moment to think about this? Or, give me a moment to think about this. Now, I had somebody do that for every question I asked in an interview. Not a great thing, right? But if you're doing it once or twice throughout the course of the interview, perfectly fine. One of the things that we always emphasize with the candidates that we work with is, practice, 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 right? It's, don't underestimate the importance, right? It's, it's being able to, prepare, but then also practicing, right? Because in practicing either by yourself or, with someone else or with an admissions consultant, you get that live feedback on how you're doing and are able to fine tune in a way that allows you to be more effective. And I think finally, think about the interview as, right, it's not just a one way they're evaluating you. Yes, that's the big important part of it, right? But it is a two-way process, right? You're trying to determine if, Kellogg is the right fit for you, right? And this is, one more data point on the path to better understanding that. Great. Now, in the world we live in today, just about every interview is virtual, right? So we've pulled together a few tips, based on our experience on, okay, what can I do to, ace the virtual interview, right? And so I'll leave aside sort of, the answering the questions and talk more about the virtual interview format specifically. So anytime you can, you want a clear and uncluttered background, right, with relatively limited distractions. I remember once I had a candidate I was interviewing, and he had this big giant plant, behind him, right? And it would have been fine if it had been set sort of outside the frame, to the left or the right, but literally the tree was growing out of his head, right? And it just ends up being an enormous distraction, right? And as you can see on my screen, right, if it works, a simple computer background like a blur could be fine. Outer space bricks, though, I mean, those can be a little bit complicated. But even Talon, right, she's in the kitchen, right, but it's a clean, uncluttered space, without a bunch of distractions. What you don't see is, right behind my left shoulder, there used to be a big printer that I've moved out of the way, and on my right shoulder, I had a chair. And for this conversation, I've moved that out as well. So, limit the distractions, right? It doesn't have to be, exactly like mine, but keep it simple if you can. Now,
And, going back to Matt, your point on the plant coming out of someone's head, I mean, just take a moment to, do a practice run,
definitely.
right? So if you don't have Zoom, if you don't have, or actually, you know what, just Google Meets or something like that. Everybody should probably have access to
Right.
that. So everybody should have access to some sort of video streaming technology, or otherwise put your phone up to your computer. Find a way to see what you look like, because sometimes your background looks different than you even think, right? Maybe that plant would have been okay had it been a foot over the other direction. So, definitely just take a moment to do that. I interviewed someone the other day for work, and they were sitting there, in their bedroom, like many of us are in this virtual world, right? And the bed wasn't made. It was just a disaster. And no judgment to people who don't make their bed at all. But I mean, you want to present yourself, in a respectable way. And having your bed unmade in the background is probably not a good idea, right? So just think about those things a little bit. And even on the day of, I encourage you to see how it looks that day. Because maybe they didn't even think about the fact that their bed was in their background, right? So, definitely see it with your own eyes as well.
Great. Lighting's important, and can be a challenge, right? So I've got my my ring light that you can't see, right? But this morning, right, when we started, the weather was a little bit dark. I noticed, 10 minutes ago that the sun started to come out a little bit, and my lighting got thrown off a little bit. But just be aware of lighting. You don't want to be in the dark, but you don't want to be overexposed either. Obviously make sure everything works. I mean, no surprise. Talon and I got on with the GMAT club, 15 minutes before we started. Make sure we could hear each other. Make sure the cameras were working. Often it's good to check if you're using Zoom or Teams or whatever, that you've got the latest version of the software, because they're constantly updating those. I know I've been at some, business meetings where I realized, 1 minute before, as I tried to log on, that I didn't have the latest version, and 7 minutes later, I finally got into the meeting. If someone's only got 30 minutes, that just gives you less time than you might have had before. Now, one of the biggest challenges is looking into the camera, right? You want to use good body language, right? So I know my camera's on top of my very large monitor. The picture of Talon and I are off on my left. The screen that shows the slide is in the middle but below the camera, right? So I have to periodically, remember, I need to look up, into the camera. And then there's some tricks that you can do as well, right? I can move the picture of the person that I'm talking to, right below my camera, minimize things, but just be aware of that. Because it can be important, because if you're constantly looking away and not at the person rather than looking at them, right, it can make a big difference in building rapport and showing engagement. Now, obviously, you want to use good posture, right? You don't want to be too close, you don't want to be too far, you don't want to be slouching, and you want to smile wherever you can. For people like Talon, that's pretty easy. They smile all the time. For people like me, I have to remember to smile, periodically. So, don't forget that. And one of the tricks that I found that I'm doing right now is I'm, sitting on the edge of my chair, leaning slightly forward, so that, I'm framed, more centrally in the picture, and trying to, appear and engage. Now, I'm obviously presenting, right? So I am very engaged, but in a back and forth conversation, right, it makes a difference if you're, leaning back, even if you're closely in the frame, like, sitting up, sitting forward, like all of these things can make a small difference. Now, one of the great things about the virtual interview, right, is you can help yourself out, right? Not for this particular presentation, but in other webinars that I've led, right? I've put, sticky cards on the edge of my monitor, right? I've got my, my notes as well, right in front of me that you can't normally see, right? You don't want them to be too detailed, right? But if there are some key points that you want to make sure that you remember, hey, here are 3 things that I want to cover, and if I don't cover them, I want to make sure I hit them at the end. And you can have those arranged around, as memory aids, but don't overcomplicate them, because it's very clear when someone starts reading something. Oh, here's exactly what I need to say, and you lose that engagement with the audience. And as Talon said earlier, hey, practice. And in this case, practice means recording yourself, right? Or doing a video interview with one of your friends, so that you can see how how your position is, your eye contact is, engagement, all of that, and whether you're using a lot of filler words, right? I mean, some of the candidates, we offer the ability to do interviews with a third party software platform, and they come back and like, man, I can't believe how many times I said or like, right? And it really helps them, get them out of the interview. Great. Any final comments, Talon?
No, I think you're doing a great job.
Awesome. All right.
I think you covered it.
So we've covered interviews. We've covered virtual interviews. Right now, let's talk about some of the questions that you can expect. Right.
Actually, Matt, to your question there, I will step in really quickly with one of the questions in the chat box, which is how much weight is given to the interview by Kellogg's AdCom. I just want to reiterate, especially at Kellogg, because almost everybody is interviewed, virtually everybody, right? It's just one piece. It's just one component of the application. So, certainly your candidacy is looked at in totality. And you want each piece to really complement one another, right? But to that tune, the interviews are conducted blind, as Matt had said. And so you can't assume that something that you wrote, in your essays or things like that is something that the interviewer already knows. That said, they do have your resume in front of them. So, you don't want it to necessarily be repetitive with the resume. You've got to explain what's not on the resume. That doesn't mean that you can't, talk about an experience that is on there. You just want to add further color than that, one-liner bullet that's on there. But certainly it's just one component. So how much weight? I would say it's viewed holistically, right? So they really look at each component in aggregate and combined to make a decision on your candidacy. So it's not like, wow, you were an absolute rock star in the interview, you're absolutely getting admission, or wow, you totally bombed the interview, you're not getting admission. It's looked at holistically.
Exactly right. You've got the messaging down. All right, let's go back and talk about, okay, so and maybe it's really 6, right? I mean, there's no right answer of the most common core questions, right? But, these are the ones that you're most likely to see, some combination of these in just about every interview, right? Most interviews start with some version of, hey, walk me through your resume, tell me about yourself, right? You can expect to get asked about your, short-term and or long-term goals, right? There's certainly the piece around, why an MBA, right? And that's, why an MBA, why now, and, why Kellogg, right? That could be its own question in itself. I put them together because I think they're closely related, and I'll talk about that in just a minute, right? And then, the last one is, how are you going to contribute and have an impact at Kellogg, right? So these are the 4 that you want to keep in mind. And if there was a 5th, right, I would say it's what else about you should I know, right? And that's the question that's hard to prepare for in advance, other than knowing, hey, there's these points I want to get across, and then on the fly, as the interview's coming to an end, being able to react to say, okay, there's a couple points or one point that I haven't gotten across, right? This is really how I'm going to answer that question. So we're going to spend just a minute on each of these to reinforce, what are some good ways to cover this. And so while this is Kellogg specific, right, for the vast majority of business schools, it's these same questions that you're most likely to see. And if you've already done your application, right, you'll already have a good sense of your goals. If you've done your resume, you have the starting point for that. So now let's dig into these just a little bit. Okay, some things to watch out for walking me through your resume. Most people start, at college and move to the present. It's the most common way. It doesn't have to be the only way. Again, as I mentioned before, don't read me your resume out loud. I've either read it in advance because I've gotten it in advance, or I've read it quickly as we got there. You're looking to add information about yourself, highlights, accomplishments, rationale for the moves or the decisions that you've made. For example, why that college, why that major, why that job, why that move, right? And then ultimately, your narrative should lead to, why is it you're there in front of that person? You're talking about an MBA and an MBA at Kellogg, right? Another big point here is 2.5, 3 minutes max, right? I had somebody go 12 minutes once on, walking me through your resume. I tried cutting them off a couple times. They didn't take the hint, but you want to be short. And again, it's highlights. You don't have to get everything across. You need to figure out what's most important to get across. Okay, what are your short and long-term goals? Right? I'm looking for something that shows a progression, direction over time, right? Almost always, I recommend starting at the endpoint and with the long-term goal and working backwards. I think it works best for 90+% of the people, right? And it allows to explain, okay, here's where I'm going long-term. Here's why my short-term goals are aligned with that. Here's how they set me up success for the long-term goals. Here's how an MBA helps me with the short-term and lay the foundation for the long-term. It's just generally a natural or an easier story to be able to tell. If you've been in, more traditional roles, banking, consulting, right? There's probably a higher level of expectation around the clarity that you should have on your goals. Not for everybody, but I think for many people, there's an expectation. Okay, you've been in some of these foundational. You really need to have a tight story. I think some of the non-traditional candidates, certainly my own experience coming from the military, right? I kind of vaguely knew that I wanted consulting, right? But I really had no idea what consulting was, right? I thought, at the time, some consulting firms that are now out of business, were the ones, right? Because they're the ones that advertised, that I had seen, that did government work. I'd never heard of, BCG, where I worked for many years, or McKinsey, or any of those. So I think for some non-traditional or less traditional candidates, right, there could be a little bit more leeway. And I think finally, make sure the passion for what you want to do comes out, right? This isn't a clinical story of, hey, logically, this is what I want to do and how it makes sense. I want you to get me excited about it as well, right? So that I can feel your passion and interest. Okay, so for why you want an MBA, why Kellogg, again, linking it back to your short and long-term goals. Hey, what are those classes, programs, extracurricular activities? There's some piece around knowledge that you don't know that you need in order to be successful, right? And hey, you've done a lot, you've accomplished a lot, but there's still things that are missing that you need in order to achieve those goals, right? So that should be the foundation for why an MBA, right? There's a piece around perspective, right? Around being more strategic or gaining global experience that can be relevant for many individuals. And then I think the final piece is around people and connections. Those people that can help you be successful longer term, right? So it's the club and the activities, right, and also how you interact with the alumni and the community, right? So you're not just there for knowledge. There are other reasons. Now, the why Kellogg, right, should build on this, right? If you're looking for something particular when it comes to a program, right? Then the why Kellogg, if you're then able to talk about, hey, I'm really interested in nonprofit work and pivoting from consulting to nonprofit, and I noticed these three things about Kellogg that I'm super excited about as it relates to nonprofit, right? They've got this nonprofit program. This one professor teaches a couple classes that are absolutely fantastic, and these two organizations, right? And that's really the way to be able to talk about why Kellogg, or why any school for that matter, is being able to link it to your why MBA. And then finally, how you're going to contribute. Now, I think the easiest way to think about this is you want the person you're interviewing to be able to visualize, you at Kellogg having an impact at Kellogg, right? Like not just hear what you're saying, but being able to see you, right? In the building, interacting, right? So be specific, right? Kellogg is also a very student-run place. So show your leadership. Hey, you're not going to be part of the consulting club, right? You're going to lead the consulting club, right? Or be one of the co-chairs, right? Because there's many people leading it, right? Now, is there some new extension to the club or activity? Hey, you've got this interested in nonprofit, but also interested in consulting. They're not really doing much in nonprofit consulting. I'm making the example up, right? Just so find some area where you can add value, extend things, take it to the next level, so that you can really show that you've done your homework. And obviously, you want to be able to connect it to something that you've done in your past or present, right? Rather than just say, hey, I'm suddenly going to be involved when I have no history of being involved. So, okay.
I think that piece is really, really important, Matt. And, many candidates that I work with, they tend to be a little shy to have the confidence in saying, I'm going to do this, or I'm going to be a leader in this group, because, saying, hey, I'm going to be president of this club or vice president of this club sounds really big, right? And it can be a little bit intimidating when, you're only 3-4 years into your career, let's say. But be bold, be confident in yourself, and also recognize that it doesn't actually have to happen, right? If once you get there on campus and you realize, you know what, actually, I'm far more passionate about this other area or whatever that is, you can absolutely pivot once you're there. So say it with conviction, with what you know to be true today, and know that it can certainly change once you are a student.
For certain. Great, thanks for that. Okay, so we've covered those relatively quickly, and now we're going to dive into behavioral questions. So for those of you who don't know what behavioral questions are, right, they're the tell me about a time questions, about how you acted in a specific situation, right? So you're being asked to share an example where you've had to demonstrate certain skills, leadership or teamwork, or how you've navigated certain types of situations, such as a difficult team situation or a conflict within a team, right? Okay, so why are these so common, right? Because they allow the interviewer to get a much better, more realistic understanding of you based on actions that you've done, right? That actual past performance, and not some theoretical future performance, right? Now, because there's a big difference between asserting and being able to demonstrate something. And I've given this, quick example at the bottom around teamwork, right? So there's a difference between saying, hey, I love working on teams and I'm a great team player, right? You're asserting that, yeah, I might believe it, I might not, right? That's very different than, okay, there was a situation, here's specific on how I worked with a team of 6 for several months on this particular project. Here's the role I played on the team in driving a major deliverable, which, changed the course of this business unit, right? One provides something, tangible that suggests how, a great team player and how much impact you'll have in the future versus just asserting it. Now, we've generally found that there are, for Kellogg, 4 main areas. This is not exclusive, right? There are other areas, right? But these are the 4 that are asked about most often, right? No surprise, you'll see, leadership and intellectual here, right? If you think back to, what Kellogg evaluates, those were 2 of the criteria. I've pulled teamwork out from interpersonal skills. But so these are the ones, right? So do you have what it takes to be an effective leader? What's your potential? Are you a team player? Can you work effectively in diverse groups for teamwork? Right? For intellectual, do you have the analytical, critical thinking, creative skills required to be successful in, rigorous analytics at an MBA program? And then finally, are you a good fit for Kellogg, right? Do you have strong listening, communication skills? Now, I'm going to quickly go through a few slides just to emphasize like the range of questions that you could see on this. There isn't a leadership question that gets asked, right? Kellogg will provide the alumni interviewers with 10, I forget the exact number that are there, but 10 potential leadership questions that cover leadership, but in a variety of different ways, right? Same for each of these other dimensions, right? So we just wanted to give you a flavor of what some of these are, right? So for leadership, right, it could be, hey, what's your biggest accomplishment? What's your leadership style? Can you tell me a time where you took the initiative, right? That's just another code word for, for leadership. What were the results? Can you tell me about a leader that you admired, right? All of those could be asked under leadership, right? So again, rather than having answers for all 9 or 10 potential leadership questions, be ready with those stories, those tangible examples from your life of where you've demonstrated, leadership and the various dimensions, or, think about a boss that you've worked with that was a particularly effective leader, or a leader that you admired, and have those at a ready so that you can pivot with your stories to however the question is asked. Similarly for teamwork, right? It could be, hey, one that I've seen recently in the interview reports is, an experience working with diverse teams, right? It could be around, what role do you typically play on a team? Could be about conflict on a team, or lack of communication, or as the last question here talks about poor leadership. Again, having 3 or 4 solid teamwork experiences will allow you to pivot and be able to address all of these. For intellectual ability, right? It could be something as simple as, hey, tell me about the most challenging problem that you've solved, right? Give me a time where you're creative. You saw something that other people didn't, right? And so think about times where you've done particularly challenging problems. Now, they could be very analytical, very Excel-based, or database-based, or programming-based, or they could be more conceptual problems as well. That could also be relevant, where they aren't as data-intensive, but just as important in solving them to have impact. Finally, for interpersonal skills, how do you work with different people, right? How do you react when somebody new joins the firm? One recently that we've seen in the last couple of years is about inclusive environments, and what your role is in creating those, right? So again, there are others, right? These aren't intended to be exclusive. They're just designed to give you a flavor for the range that you could expect for any one of these dimensions. All right. As we come down the home stretch, I'm just going to briefly touch on, some of the challenging questions, and we've labeled them challenging. And I'll share some of the ones that I've seen candidates struggle with. I think the big the big caveat here is you need to figure out what your own challenging questions are, right? Because they will be different for every person. Um, and so as you go through interview reports, as you do interviews, think about which ones did you struggle with, right? Here are some of the common ones, right? And we'll just highlight, hey, what do you consider to be your greatest weakness, right? This is one of those you don't want to highlight. My greatest weakness is I work too hard or I'm too smart. So don't disguise a strength, right? They want real candidates that are self-aware, that are aware of of what their weakness or weaknesses are, right? And have worked on improving them, over time. And it could, often I tell people, well, think about, what you're not performing at in the role above you, right? If you think about your boss, for example, what does your boss do, right? What are some of the roles and responsibilities, right, that you just haven't been exposed to? Yeah, that can often be a great way to think about, well, what your weakness is. Another one is, describe a conflict at work and your role in it, right? So this is about describing a genuine conflict, not some kind of manufactured role. You can talk about, what you did to help resolve it, but also think about, lessons learned and what you do differently as a result now. There's when someone gave you less than positive feedback, right? That certainly, happens to nearly all of us, right? There's always something that we could improve upon, right? So here you want to make sure that you're open to feedback, right? That you really listen, right? That you develop a plan to improve on that feedback and that you get better over time. Another take on strengths and weaknesses could be, how would others describe you, right? I know when I was preparing for this sort of for consulting interviews, sort of post MBA, I talked to some of my friends and said, okay, what are some of the words that you would use, just to make sure that my perception of the words I was using aligned with how others thought of me. Now you want these to be positive, often related to the criteria that Kellogg is looking for. Uh, Tell me about a time when you failed. Now, again, here, don't manufacture a failure. Failure is okay these days, right? They don't expect everyone to be brilliant, all the time. And if you haven't had a chance to fail, entrepreneurs would say you're not trying hard enough. You're playing it too safe. The important piece isn't that you did or didn't fail. It's what you learned from that failure and what you're doing differently now. And then finally, where else are you applying, right? I've seen this in a couple interview reports. It's not that common. I know a lot of other schools ask it as well. They can ask it for two reasons, right? Some schools are trying to gauge yield, right? Like, are you really interested, and how do we fit in the schools that you're applying to? That's not generally the case for Kellogg. They're generally interested to understand, how much thought you've put into the criteria for the schools that you're applying to, how much research and deliberation that you've done. So don't be afraid to answer this, but think about a like set of schools to Kellogg. Make sure you have a clear criteria on what you're looking for in a school, to be able to address that. So I had a couple slides to go through these. I've tried to do the quick and dirty, just looking at the time. So I'll skip over the next three slides, just to be able to come to the what to ask your interviewer, right? So this is something that interview prep often overlooks, right? So it's somewhat helpful to you if you haven't had a chance to talk to anyone in the who's currently in the school or a recent grad. We strongly recommend that. That's the best way to learn about the school, right? But the interviewer's answers can help you assess the program as well. So you're learning something. It's a new data point, as I mentioned before, right? It's also a great opportunity to shine, right? It's one piece of the holistic process, right? But if you can nail it and do really well, right, that's going to incrementally help you right? So it's an opportunity to make a great impression and show your interest and engagement in the program. Now, having said all that, you want to make sure you ask a good question, right? Don't ask anything that you could have gotten from, a website, a brochure, a basic blog. Do your homework, right? These are second level questions that you should be asking, right? So, just to recap, make sure you ask at least one question, right? Almost always you'll be asked, hey, do you have any questions at the end? And if you don't ask any, right, then they'll assume you aren't interested. So even if all your regular questions have been answered, if you have 3 questions ready to go, generally there's one that you can ask. You can ask about their experience at the school, what they enjoyed the most, or narrow in on a particular program or piece that they did, right? So there's always something more that you can learn about the interviewer and their experience at the very basic level that you should be prepared to ask. Ideally, you're asking something that's relevant for your goals, tailored to the interviewer. Sometimes you can't ask questions that you really want to ask because the interviewer's not going to know, right? So if you get somebody that's 20 years outside of Kellogg, right, it's a different kind of question you ask versus someone that graduated just a couple years ago that did exactly what you want to study and is in the job that you want to be in. So it can be very different, but don't ignore this, and make sure you've got 3 questions. All right. So we've gone over a little bit from a time perspective, but I think I got through most of that. So Talan, I'll turn it over to you for any questions that you see.
Yeah, absolutely. And, touching on one of Matt's last points on, questions to ask the interviewer, I just want to reinforce, absolutely, even if you've already asked other people that you've talked to certain questions about their experience, ask again, right? I mean, because that's a new person and a new data point, right? So just because one person told you a certain perspective on, what it's like to be an alumni, or how they're getting involved as an alumni, what types of experiences they most enjoyed on campus. It's great to ask those questions of multiple people, and people love to talk about themselves. So, certainly kind of butter up your interviewer by saying, oh, hey, when you introduced yourself, you had mentioned X, Y, and Z. Tell me more about that. That can often leave kind of on the right foot to kind of showcase to the interviewer that, hey, you were listening when they first introduced themselves as well. All right, so yes, we are ready for Q&A. So what I'm going to do right now is kind of scroll the chat box, see if there were any questions from before that we had missed. But also, this is your opportunity to ask additional questions if you might have them. So let's see. There was one right here about awkward moments in the interview. So there's a question that says, if by chance in the middle of the interview, a candidate suddenly yawns, maybe because that day was a bit hectic, right? How to handle a weird situation like that. So whether it's a yawn, whether it's, someone walking in the background, or, an accidental situation like that. These things happen, especially when you're working from home, right? So I would say make light of it, but don't dwell on it, right? So, you can quickly acknowledge it if needed, or you can just absolutely ignore it. I mean, sometimes if you are someone who is able to bypass those types of distractions and act like it's not happening, that can actually show a lot of composure, right? And sometimes when you draw too much attention to something, then it just makes it that much bigger of a deal. Mm-hmm. So if it's so overt that it's absolutely necessary to address, go ahead and do it, but move right on, right? Do not dwell on it. But I think everyone understands that these things happen. But to the specific question, on yawning, right? I mean, hopefully you can find a way to not maybe be so tired for the interview, whether you need another cup of coffee or whatever that is. You need to go right before the interview, do a couple laps in your house or something to get some adrenaline going, so that you're lively. That would be ideal. But of course, if it happens, just, move right along.
Right. Exactly right.
Let's see here. So Any other additional questions to mention here? Okay, this is a good one, Vipin, and excuse me if I'm mispronouncing your name. People mispronounce my name all the time, so I apologize. Does subpar language skills, especially for international students, have a super negative impact in an interview? All right, Matt, do you have a perspective on that one, or would you like me to jump in?
So certainly feel free to build on my answer. So I think there's a certain minimum level of proficiency, right, that's required in English to to be successful at Kellogg. Having said that, right, I remember in my first year team, I had a student from Japan, right, whose English was actually quite good. He just didn't ever want to speak in front of other people. So I would say there's a minimum level of proficiency that's required. But I think in an interview, people are still going to try and make you feel as comfortable as possible, to be able to learn. There could be some other test that could be potentially required. I don't know, Talan, your experience as well.
Yeah. So if it tends to be a real inhibitor for you, you have a thick accent or something that makes it difficult for others sometimes to understand you in, the English tongue, there actually are coaches, accent coaches and things like that can help. I was just speaking with one of our consultants the other day who shared a story of an applicant that they were working with that found us after 3 times of failed admission cycles. And our coach had recommended, that they work with an accent coach. Mm-hmm. And really all they had to do was work with them for a couple of hours and had an absolute breakthrough. And then they were extremely successful that admissions round. But it was that interview that kept kind of, hindering them because the interviewer just simply couldn't understand what they were trying to say. So there are options out there for you if that is a real inhibitor for you, and options that actually don't necessarily always take a ton of time or a ton of money. Let's see. So now we have a question by Tan around, would too little work experience, like 1 to 2 years, hurt your MBA admission chances? Here, I can start, and then Matt, certainly please build upon this if you'd like. Really, it ultimately comes down to, what you have achieved in your experiences. It's not about, okay, we're not going to admit you if you have just 1 or 2 years of experience, or we're not going to admit you if you have 10, 12 years of experience because it's too much. It's really about what you bring to the class and how you would really round out that class. So if you've done a lot, and really had some huge, achievements and impact within those 1 to 2 years, certainly you could be a viable MBA candidate. I think it's important, though, that you should be cognizant of the fact that is, less than the average for most schools. Most schools would probably hover between 3 to 5 years, depending on the program. And so those people may have, a much richer and broader perspective to bring. So I think that's something to just really be cognizant of. At the MBA Exchange, we do offer free consultations as well for any candidate who might be interested in applying for an MBA. And, we can offer that up just by going to our website. There's a button right on there that says free consultation. Feel free to fill out a little form about yourself, and we can, provide more details and perspective on your unique situation as well.
Yeah, I think it's the quality of your work experience, rather than the time is really what Kellogg is evaluating, right? They want to see, what you've accomplished, career progression, and that's harder in 1 to 2 years to demonstrate. So there are relatively fewer people that have that experience, that have that time of experience, if you will. But again, it's the quality of the experience that you've had.
Absolutely. And I think that, this answer as well, that, this perspective that Matt and I both just shared also addresses Yasho's question from a little bit earlier, which was, can one do an executive MBA with 12 years of work experience? So I think the exact same answer would apply. Any other questions from the crowd today? All right. Well, I'm sure many more questions will come up over, whether it's later today, reflecting on some of the great content that Matt shared today, or whether it's weeks, months from now. So please know that we would love to meet you. You can find us at www.mbaexchange.com. So please go ahead and take a look, and we're here for you if you should ever want to chat again.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.